So Once Upon a Time is a show that existed. Hello everybody, welcome back to Meddling in Antiquity. My name is Teray, and today we're going to be discussing the ABC hit TV show, Once Upon a Time. So before I dive into the show, I want to give a bit of a summary of what the show is about. So we start off with this character, Emma Swan, and Emma is a bounty hunter. She's been an orphan her entire life, and eventually this kid shows up at her house and says he's her son. And through that kid, she finds out that she is the daughter of Snow White and Prince Charming. And there is a town in Maine called Storybrooke where all of these fairy tale characters are living because they're from this place called the Enchanted Forest, and Henry has a book that tells him all of the stories, and their job is to bring magic back to these characters. And that's just a very brief synopsis of the first season, and I'm not going to get into it any more than that. Now, you may be thinking, hey, isn't that Disney thing that everybody was up their own asses about for a while, from like 2010 to 2018? Yes, it was. It was an experience. I mean, the first couple seasons were good, but then they started reaching a little bit, and that's where it gets a little suspicious. So now that I've given you a bit of a brief synopsis of the show itself, let's dive into what I like about the show, what I dislike about the show. My feelings about Once Upon a Time as a show closely mirror my feelings about Gotham. And if you want to check out my opinions on Gotham, go ahead and check out my video about it, which I will go ahead and link up here, which is that it was a good show for the first few seasons. And I will say Once Upon a Time had a few more good seasons than Gotham, considering there's a difference of several seasons between the two shows. Gotham only had 5 seasons. Once Upon a Time had, I believe, 7 or 8. I stopped watching at some point and I just never finished. So it's one of those. It's one of those. It's one of those that you get into and you're like, oh yeah, and then eventually you find you're watching it out of obligation instead of actual enjoyment. So you have to just give up in the middle of a season and you're just like, well, this might as well happen, you know? But I really enjoyed seasons 1 through 3 of Once Upon a Time, just as seasons 1 through 3 were kind of some of my favorites. Season 4 was really good. Season 5, I think, is where it started to fall apart for me enjoyment-wise. However, one thing I do really appreciate about Once Upon a Time is the cast and the casting. So the main cast we have are Lana Parrilla, a woman who I'd like to step on me, Jennifer Morrison, a woman who I would also like to step on me, Jennifer Goodwin, Josh Dallas, and quite a few other people, but those are kind of the main important characters that we see through. Oh, and Robert Carlyle, who, if you are a listener of my Let Me Explain podcast, which is a podcast that I now co-host, if you go check out episode 2, they talk about Eragon, and if you know the movie Eragon, you'll know that Robert Carlyle also plays Durza, and if you know Durza, you'll know that Robert Carlyle took Durza and made it Rumpelstiltskin. So if you're an Eragon fan and you haven't seen Once Upon a Time, think Durza. Like, if you're imagining Rumpelstiltskin, think Durza, but he's gold and worse. And then you have Rumpelstiltskin. But it had all the supporting cast and the eventual larger ensemble cast they have are phenomenal. It's one of those shows really like Gotham where the cast absolutely does make the show, and there are far too many of them for me to name just outright. But they're all fantastic, and I really recommend checking out all the other things that they've done because they are freaking excellent. The cast is excellent. And a thing I really appreciate about the casting aspect of it is that they cast completely colorblind. And that's one of the things that I loved the most about the show is the casting was 100% colorblind for the whole thing. Ursula, black. Actual East Asian and Indian people playing Asian and Indian characters, you got it. Jamie, no, was it? No, it wasn't Jamie Chung. Was it Jamie Chung? Yeah. Jamie Chung, who was also on Gotham, actually plays Mulan in Once Upon a Time. They have people of color playing characters of color, and then they bring more people of color in to play characters who are not traditionally characters of color. And I think that's one of the best things about the show. That is really the saving grace, is they don't cast on the basis of race. The casting is completely colorblind, and I really, really appreciate that. Because Black Ursula, absolutely, 100%. And you know what? She kicks ass. Whole show. 10 out of 10, she's incredible. And there's a lot of that really, I think, is the saving grace, like I said, is the colorblind casting and the cast itself, because they all embody these characters they play so phenomenally well. And in the case of Robert Carlyle, sometimes a little too well. Just a little. But that's the thing I like about the show. Now, similar to Gotham, the plots can get a little convoluted, and that's why I think season 5 falls apart a little bit for me, because there are so many different storylines to play into, and they brought in 2 things that probably could have meshed well, but didn't. Because the seasons tend to be a combination of different stories. Later, eventually when we get to season 3, it's like they start combining different Disney stories and bringing them into this world. But I'm going to get into that in our next segment where I talk about my dislikes. So let's get into those really quickly. Now, my dislikes of Once Upon a Time are very similar to the dislikes I had with Gotham. Like I said, my opinions about this show are very similar to the ones I have about Gotham, and that is plot-wise and kind of setting-wise. After, I believe, season 3 is where it gets a little tricky, and then season 5 specifically was a kind of cluster F of just too many ideas crammed into one thing. But it was also an idea that had been so overused, and I think that really was a detriment to them as a whole. And I think season 6 also is a very interesting one because, well, season 5, they used King Arthur. So that was kind of the beginning of bringing in classical literature, characters, and stories, because you see Arthur, Merlin, Guinevere, Lancelot, the Knights of the Round Table. But that's an idea that we've seen so many times. And it's an idea that's so popular in like modern mythos. The idea of King Arthur is something that has persisted forever. Because you have that Avalon High movie. You have Kingsman, which is all based on King Arthur. You have Merlin, which is now, I guess, quarantine was like, hey, why don't we jump back on BBC's ass and just all watch old shows? And Merlin was one that people picked, which it's great. It's fabulous. It's got Santiago Cabrera. There's nothing wrong with it. Don't hold me to that. I'm not done with it yet, and I will eventually do a video on it. But it's the combination. They combined that with Brave, and it was an attempt, certainly, but it was an attempt that didn't go very well because they tried to make Brave edgier than it was. Though I did like the race-blind casting because a woman of color, Gwen was a woman of color, and Merlin and Lancelot were both black, which, fabulous, fantastic, 10 out of 10 for the, like I said, the colorblind casting. There's nothing wrong with the colorblind casting. It's everything else. But they tried to make things edgier. Like they made Peter Pan like really edgy in season 3, which, as much as I like season 3, that was a bit of a turnoff for me. Yeah, it's it's kind of, they took these things and tried to make them edgier for an older audience. And I think in some cases that was a misstep, but the thing that pisses me off the most about the show specifically is in season 5 going into season 6. Because they go to Camelot in the latter half of throughout season 5. And season 5 is a season where they introduce classical literature characters. So we see a bunch of these really cool references to classical literature. Like, we see the balloon from War of the World in 80 Days. They have a whole plot line about Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. And the Count of Monte Cristo gets his own sub-story. And then we never see any of the other classic literature characters who showed up in Storybrooke. We get Camelot for the first half of Camelot and Brave for the first half of season 5. Then we get a Jekyll and Hyde storyline and a Count of Monte Cristo subplot. And then we never see any other classic literature characters for the rest of the run of the show. Which I think is a missed opportunity, because classic literature is also hugely popular. They could have brought in the Three Musketeers. That would have been fantastic. If they're going to do Dumas, they might as well have brought the Musketeers in. They could have brought in Phineas Fogg. They could have had him as a character, but they actively chose to throw those references in and then absolutely do nothing with them. And that kills me to this day, because that would have made the show so much more exciting to watch, is to see these true fantasy, traditional grim fairy tales interacting with classic literature characters would have been fantastic, and they missed the opportunity. And that, on top of the plot, is one of the biggest killers of the show for me. And that's where I started getting a little disillusioned with the show as a whole, is when they had that opportunity and they set it up like they were going to do it and then didn't. And that was a huge disappointment for me as someone who's a huge fan of Alexandre Dumas, that the Count of Monte Cristo only got 2 episodes. And someone who would have loved to see the Three Musketeers, because it's one of my favorite novels of all time. But they chose not to, and it is a huge disappointment for me. Like, they could have battled an H.P. Lovecraft villain, and they actively chose to not take the steps to do that. And that, it hurts my soul every day I think about it. Because it would have made the show so much more interesting to watch. And they just didn't do it. They set it up, and then they fell through, which sucks. But I think that's about it for my additional thoughts on the show. So let's get into final thoughts. So throughout this, I've consistently compared my thoughts on Once Upon a Time to my thoughts on Gotham. And that is really the most accurate way I can say it, because they had a very similar way of handling things. Because the earlier seasons are good and they're fun to watch, but there was a stumbling block that they hit and they tripped and then they just slid the rest of the way home. Though I feel like Once Upon a Time did really manage to kind of resurrect the original feel of the show with its 8th and final season, which is where they kind of went back to the original storyline, and essentially it's almost a repeat of the first season, but in a different place. And these characters have different identities, and there's a lot more people of color because they're in a different location. But I feel like it did manage to kind of resurrect itself, but there was a lot of stumbling blocks along the way. And I actually had to quit just about the halfway point of season 7 because I wasn't enjoying the show like I thought I would, like I had initially anymore, and it killed me. But the biggest thing that got me was them not going with the classic literature route and having those characters interact with the characters that we already are familiar with in Disney and traditional fantasy stories. I think that would have done the show a huge service, and it was just, they didn't take the opportunity that they presented themselves with. And I feel like that was a massive misstep, because that would have brought more viewership to the show as well, because fantasy is not everybody's thing, but if you add fantasy and classic literature, that brings in a whole new audience, and they didn't do it. And that really did kind of assassinate the show for me emotionally, to watch it and enjoy it thoroughly as I had through the first several seasons. But it is a good show. If you are a huge Disney fan, I'd recommend watching it because you're going to enjoy yourself no matter what. It is a good show. It really is. I personally do still enjoy occasionally going back and watching like a couple of the episodes in the earlier seasons, because it is an enjoyable show to watch. It's just the up and from about season 5 to season 7, just it was more out of obligation than anything. But it is a very good show. And if you're looking for something to watch while you're still in quarantine, if you want to binge watch a couple seasons, that's an excellent show to do it, because you can just sit, and bonus points, Sebastian Stan's in it, and he plays the Mad Hatter from Alice in Wonderland. So if you're suffering from Marvel withdrawals because Falcon and the Winter Soldier has been delayed on Disney Plus, which I am also very sad about, go back and watch the episodes with the Mad Hatter in it on Once Upon a Time, and then you'll get your Sebastian Stan fix, that sexy Romanian man. Outside of that, I think that about wraps us up for Serial Scrutiny, and I will see everybody on, let me check my schedule real quick, Wednesday for One Off Wonders. Bye.